Good evening. My name is Joseph Sippets, and it's time for another Saturday night story with St. Joseph County Public Library. And tonight I'll be reading part of an article from Hunter S. Thompson, the great gonzo journalist. It's excerpted in his book, The Great Short Hunt. And this particular article is called Freak Power in the Rockies. It's about an election in Aspen, Colorado in 1969 with possible relevance to our current day. So here we go. 2 hours before the polls closed, we realized that we had no headquarters, no hole or great hall where the faithful could gather for the awful election night death watch, or to celebrate the great victory that suddenly seemed very possible. We had run the whole campaign from a long oaken table in the Jerome Tavern on Main Street, working flat out in public so anyone can see or even join if they felt ready. But now, in these final hours, we wanted a bit of privacy. Some clean, well-lighted place, as it were, to hunker down and wait. We also needed vast quantities of ice and rum and a satchel of brain-rattling drugs for those who wished to finish the campaign on the highest possible note, regardless of the outcome. But the main thing we needed, with dusk coming down and the polls due to close at 7 p.m., was an office with several phone lines for a blizzard of last-minute calls to those who had not yet voted. We'd collected the voting list just before 5 from our poll watcher teams who had been checking them off since dawn, and it was obvious from a very quick count that the critical freak power vote had turned out in force. Joe Edwards, a 29-year-old lawyer, biker racer from Texas, looked like he might, in the waning hours of Election Day, November 1969, be the next mayor of Aspen, Colorado. The retiring mayor, Dr. Robert Bugsy Barnard, had been broadcasting vicious radio warnings for the previous 48 hours, raving about long prison terms for vote fraud and threatening violent harassment by phalanxes of poll watchers for any strange or freaky-looking scum who might dare to show up in the polls. We checked the laws and found that Barnard's radio warnings were a violation of voter intimidation statutes, and so I called the DA and tried to have the mayor arrested at once. But the DA said, "Leave me out of it. Police your own elections," which we did. With finely organized teams of poll watchers, 2 inside each polling place at all times, with 6 more outside in vans with trucks full of beef, coffee, propaganda, checklists, and bound Xerox copies of all Colorado voting laws. The idea was to keep massive assistance available at all times, so all our point men inside the official voting places. And the reasoning behind this rather public act was our concern that the mayor and his cops would create a kind of ugly scene early on and rattle the underground grapevine with fear rumors that would scare off a lot of our voters. Most of our people were fearful of any kind of legal hassle at the polls, regardless of their rights. So it seemed important that we make it very clear from the start that we knew the laws and we were not going to tolerate any harassment of our people. None. Each poll watcher was on the dawn shift was given a portable tape recorder with a microphone that he was instructed to stick in the face of any opposition poll watcher who asked anything beyond the legally allowable questions regarding name, age, and residence. Nothing else could be asked under penalty of an obscure election law relating to frivolous challenge, a little brother of the far more serious challenge of voter intimidation. And since the only person who had actually threatened to intimidate voters was the mayor, we decided to force the confrontation as soon as possible in Ward Number 1, where Bugsy had announced that he would personally stand the first poll watching shift for the opposition. If the buggers wanted confrontation, we decided to give it to them. The polling place in Ward 1 was a lodge called Crest House, owned by an old and infamous Swiss Nazi who called himself Guido Meyer. Martin Bormann went to Brazil, but Guido went to Aspen, arriving here several years after the Great War. And ever since then, he had spent most of his time and energy getting even with the country by milking the tourists and having young poor people arrested. So Guido was watching eagerly when the mayor arrived in the parking lot 10 minutes before 7, creeping his Porsche through a gauntlet of silent Edwards people. We had mustered a half dozen of the scurviest-looking legal voters that we could find, and when the mayor arrived at the polls, these freaks were ready to vote. Behind them, lounging around a coffee dispenser in an old VW van, were at least a dozen others. most of them large and bearded and several eager for violence. Bugsy looked horrified. It was the first time in his long experience that he had ever laid eyes on a group of non-passive, super aggressive heads. And what had got into them? And why were their eyes so wild? And why were they yelling, "You're Bugsy, we're going to croak you. Your whole act is doomed. We're going to beat your like a gong." Who were they? All strangers? Some gang of ugly bikers or speed freaks from San Francisco? Yes, of course, that Edwards had brought in a bunch of ringers. But then he looked again and recognized the head of the group, his ex-drink-along bar buddy, Brad Reed. At the head of the group, a potter and known gun freak, 6'4", 220, grinning through his beard, saying nothing, just smiling. Great God, he knew the others too. There was Don Davidson, the accountant, smooth-shaven and quite normal-looking, in a sleek maroon ski parka, but not smiling at all. And what were they all doing out here in the midst of this menacing mob? What indeed? He scurried inside to meet Guido, but instead ran into Tom Benton, a hairy artist known as Radical. Benton was grinning like a crocodile and waving a small black microphone saying, "Welcome, Bugsy, you're late. Your voters are waiting outside." Yes, I did see them out there, did you? Were they friendly? And if you wonder what I'm doing with this here, I'm Joe Edwards, poll watcher, and the reason I have this little black machine here is I want to tape every word you say when you start committing felonies by harassing our voters. The mayor lost the first confrontation almost instantly. One of the first obvious Edwards voters of the day was a blonde kid who looked like about 17. Bugsy began to jabber at him, and Benton moved in with the microphone, ready to intervene. But before Benton could utter a word, the kid began snarling at the mayor. "Go F yourself, Bugsy. You figure out how old I am. I know the law. I don't have to show you proof of anything. You're a dying man. Bugsy, get out of my way. I'm ready to vote." The mayor's next bad encounter was with a very heavy young girl with no front teeth, wearing baggy gray t-shirt, no bra. Someone had brought her to the polls, but when she got there, she was crying, actually shaking in fear. She refused to go inside. We weren't allowed within 100 feet of the door, and we got word to Benton. He came out to escort the girl in. She voted despite Bugsy's protests, and when she came outside again, she was grinning like she had just clinched Edward's victory all by herself. After that, we stopped worrying about the mayor. No goons had shown up with blackjacks, no cops were in evidence, and Benton had established full control of his turf around the ballot box. The central problem that we had grappled with that fall was the gap that separated head culture from activist politics, somewhere in the nightmare of failure that gripped America between 1965 and 1970. The old Berkeley-born notion of beating the system by fighting it gave way to the numb conviction that it made more sense in the long run to flee or even to simply hide than to fight the on anything even vaguely resembling its own terms. Our 10-day registration campaign had focused almost entirely on the dropout culture. They wanted no part of activist politics, and it had been a hellish effort to convince them to register at all. We were in for a very long night, waiting for the ballots to be counted by hand, and even before the polls closed, we knew we had changed this whole structure of Aspen politics. The old guard was doomed, and the liberals were terrorized, and the underground had emerged, and the terrible suddenness, and a very serious power trip. Throughout the campaign, I'd been promising on the streets and in the bars that if Edwards won this mayor's race, I would run for sheriff next year, November 1970. And it never occurred to me that I would actually have to run, no more than I seriously believed we could mount a serious takeover bid in Aspen. But now it was happening. Even Edwards, a skeptic from the start, had said on election eve that he thought we were going to win big. When he said it, we were in the office sorting out Xerox copies of the Colorado election laws for our poll-watching teams. I recall being stunned at his optimism. "Never in hell," I said. "If we win it all, it's going to be damn close, like 25 votes. But his commitment had jangled me badly. Damn, I thought. Maybe we will win. And what then? It turns out they did lose by 6 votes, although Hunter says that there was 5 votes that had absentee votes that had arrived late. So this is indeed a cautionary tale for our own times, and perhaps a bit of inspiration as well. Make sure to register to vote this fall. You want to get in there, make your voice heard. It's really important that you do that, and it's easy too. Registering is pretty quick. Voting, you can vote in person. In early October, you can just walk into the county city building, show them your ID, and then vote. It takes all of 10 minutes. I want to urge everybody to do that. And there we go. Good evening.